Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar. This is the second in the latest series of webinars that have been organized by the Fetisov Journalism Awards to really focus attention on the journalism that has been receiving prizes in recent years, but also it's highlighting high quality journalism, and the lessons that we learn from the people who are engaged in it. We know that journalism these days faces enormous number of problems, but the work that's being done by journalists to tell our stories is more important than it ever has been. And one of the most difficult stories that we have to tell is the story about climate change, the story about the threats to our environment, the story, in fact, that is of such great importance to the whole of humanity. So we're really pleased today to focus attention on the issue of reporting the environment and the difficulties that involves for journalists, the challenges that they face, the dangers that they face very often, and really their experience in telling these stories under very difficult conditions and what we all can learn from it. I must say it's a real privilege and an honor to be associated with the Fetisov Journalism Awards, because it keeps us in touch and in contact with some of the most courageous and the most professional of journalism that we witness every year when we are processing the awards and dealing with all of the entries that we receive. So tonight we're going to be focusing on the environment. We've got a wonderful team. We're going to hear from Andrés Bermúdez, who's a Colombian environmental journalist. He'll be speaking really about his experience in Latin America. We are going to hear from Ruth Maclean and Caleb Kabanda, who have done tremendously important work highlighting the challenges that are facing those seeking to protect the environment in Central Africa, and really looking at how those communities are dealing with the challenges that they face. And very often it's a story that's not really well known. And the final award winner on our panel will be Karla Mendes, who's an award-winning Brazilian journalist. And she too will be able to take us through some of the really difficult challenges that journalists in Brazil and that part of the world are facing in dealing with the environmental story. We'll also hear later on from our colleagues at the Fetisov Journalism Awards. Nadia will be speaking later on. It's great to see our colleagues from the FJA. This is just to let you know that we are going to hear from our panelists, and then if you have any questions, and I hope you will have questions, you can, we will have a question and answer session towards the end. And if you've got questions that you want to put into the chat, please put them in and we'll try to make sure that they get answered. But before all that, it really gives me great pleasure to introduce our introductory speaker today, and that's Barbara Trionfi. Barbara is an old friend of mine, but she's a great friend of journalists around the world and has been so for many years. Her staunch work with the International Press Institute, where she was the executive director for many years, has really sort of placed her at the center of discussion about global journalism and how it develops. Now she's acting as a consultant and a leading press freedom and journalism expert, and is doing herself great work, particularly around this issue of the environment. She's currently working as an academic with the new Institute for Environmental and Humanities at the University of Venice. And so therefore we thought it was entirely appropriate, because she's also a judge with the Fetisov Journalism Awards, that with her experience, her up-to-date knowledge, she would be an absolutely excellent person to make an introduction and to really perhaps sort of pinpoint some of the issues that we want to cover today. So, but Barbara, it's lovely to see you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Aidan, for the very extensive introduction, and many thanks to Fetisov Journalism Award for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here, and a pleasure also to talk a little bit about the research that I've been carrying out in recent months with the University in Venice, but also with the IPI. So as climate change is becoming an ever more pressing question for everybody's lives, journalists and news organizations have been facing the challenge of covering environmental and climate development in a way that is accurate, relevant, and mostly help their audiences make sense of what is happening around them. But in order to do this also meant for news organizations to reorganize and to mobilize resources and develop capacity of their journalists. And environmental subjects are complex. They tend to be polarizing, unfortunately. There are often very strong interests linked to the fossil fuel industry or others that we are investigating in environmental stories. There is a lot of disinformation campaigns that circulate on these topics, and all of this makes coverage of environmental and stories particularly dangerous and challenging, but it also underscores the need for strong and independent journalism in this area. So I'll try to go through maybe some of the challenges and some of the strategies that I've seen newsrooms adopting in this area. And as I said, it's just some, because the list would be so much longer, but I look forward to also hearing from the panelists about this. Starting from the challenges, so I mentioned resources. Resources is a big issue across journalism, but certainly in the moment we need to cover the environment better, more. We need additional resources, and we need to offer specific training to our journalists, so that they can understand and grasp and reflect the complexity of the topics they're covering. In addition, there is a challenge that journalists have been facing of so-called, what I would call, of perceived activism. So how can journalists cover climate stories? I mentioned before, the climate is a very divisive issue. So how can journalists cover climate stories without being perceived as activists, being perceived as taking side? Most stories related to climate change and environmental degradation are alarming, and journalists rightly feel the duty to remind audiences about the need to act fast. However, some interpret this call to action as a form of activism, which doesn't go well with journalism. The second challenge I wanted to mention is the challenge related to so-called news avoidance. Intentional news avoidance is a typical outcome of coverage of doom and gloom news. So audiences are confronted with depressing doom and gloom topics, and instead of, they prefer to just avoid it all. And climate and environmental news are, for the most part, terribly depressing. So how can we make sure that we share news which are indeed alarming, but without giving a sense that nothing can be done about it? So without pushing our audiences into what's so-called news avoidance rather than action. There is a challenge linked to impact. So journalism has, for journalists traditionally, they feel they're there to tell the facts, end of story. But with environmental journalism, because of the urgency of the crisis, many have called for a different approach, which is, and there is an expectation that environmental coverage is so compelling to induce action. So there is an expectation that journalism about environment leads to action and has impact. However, how do we measure this impact? And what does it mean in terms of the editorial decisions that we take? And finally, what I also wanted to mention, because I know will be dealt with today, safety. Safety is a big issue when we cover many environmental stories in Latin America, in Central Asia, certainly, and many other parts of the world. Journalists who cover environmental stories are target of attacks. And in some parts of the world, local journalists simply cannot cover certain stories without risking their lives. And actually, the sad killing of Dom Phillips and and Bruno Pereira in Brazil also showed that it's a danger not only for the local journalists, but also the international. So how can we keep journalists safe? Turning into the strategies, as I said, I looked at different ones, but there are just a couple that I wanted to mention here in case our speakers want to pick up on those. One that has been mentioned by many is an effort to what people call unsilo environmental journalism. So don't cover environmental stories as a separate beat. So climate change is so pervasive, it affects all aspects of our lives, that it should not be presented on a separate section of a news outlet or even produced by a separate group, by a separate desk, by a separate team of journalists. But so climate change is no longer just a science story, but it is a political story, it's an economic story, it's a cultural story, it's a societal story. So let's cover it in that way. The second strategy that also some have adopted to avoid news avoidance is to go into solution journalism. So focus on the solutions, focus on, but also question the solution, investigate them, make sure that our audiences know which solutions should be considered and which ones are just too simplistic or not going to work. So a focus on solutions should not reduce the sense of urgency, but it should give audiences agency, it should empower them to act. And finally, and again, relevant for today's conversation, collaborations. Collaboration in journalism is an increasingly common practice, is something that also we have seen a lot at among the Fetisov Journalism Award winners, cross-border cooperation and others. In environmental journalism, what I've seen a lot, what many put is collaboration, news outlets that operate at the local level and those that operate at the national or the international level. So these type of cooperation would help increase impact, increase reach, ensure a better use of resources, but also in some cases even ensure greater safety. I'll leave it there for today because I really look forward to hearing from our panelists. Back to you, Aidan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I mean, I must say, Barbara, you've started off by giving us a sort of shopping list of things that we have to really address. I mean, and it's a very heavyweight list, and each of the points that you've made are really important. The question of journalism as activism, the problem about the bad news stories, the need for safety, the need for testing and monitoring impact, and that question of mainstreaming. How do we mainstream the environmental story? I mean, thank you very much indeed. You've laid out a very broad set of challenges that I hope that our panelists may pick up on. If not, I shall definitely come back to some of them in the question and answer later on. Thank you very much indeed for that. I'd like now to ask to introduce Andrés. Andrés Bermúdez is a Colombian environmental journalist at the Latin American Center for Investigative Journalism, CLIP. I did a very brief intro at the beginning, so for those who've come a little bit late, he's a Fetisov Award winner in 2020. As part of, was involved in the cross-border investigation, Land of Resistance. It was an absolutely excellent example of what Barbara called the need for cross-border collaboration in terms of journalism and stories. And it was particularly focused, and I think that the Dom Phillips and Bruno Pereira sort of tragedy highlights it, the question of violence against environmental defenders in Latin America. So Andrés, you have already got quite a deal of experience in this particular area, but please, let's hear what you think about these issues.
Thank you very much, Aidan, for the presentation. You anticipated just the thing I was going to say. I was going to say I'm deeply honored to be invited by the Fetisov Awards to be part of this webinar, as we were honored to have featured in the 2020 awards with our project that I'm going to show a little bit about today. Regarding what we see as, as the environmental, the problems faced by environmental leaders and increasingly by environmentally related journalists from all sorts of powers, whether it be political, criminal, corporate. I think that what I'm going to show you is first a little bit about what we found in our project, and then how it relates to us as journalists working on environmental issues. So back in 2018, we got together with a group of journalists, initially from 7 countries in Latin America, and then we took it up to 16 countries by the 4th edition that we launched in 2021. So we worked for a total of 3 years, a group of almost 80 journalists, trying to understand both the magnitude of the problem of violence against environmental leaders and trying to investigate some of these cases in depth. So in the end, we published 50 long format stories investigating different sorts of attacks against journalists, against environmental leaders. And we built this data set that spanned, I think it was 12 years. The data today runs up until 2021. Trying to map how many of these attacks had taken place in Latin America against environmental leaders or communities. And we found a staggering number of 2,460 cases across these 17 countries. We decided to focus not only on homicides or murders, which was the type of crime that was more visible, or at least has gotten more attention from NGOs like Frontline Defenders or Witness. And we try to understand all sorts of crimes, everything from threats, forced displacement, sexual violence, legal harassment, criminalization by state governments. And well, what we found was this truly horrific picture of how bad it is right now in Latin America. I've often asked myself, why is it that bad in Latin America? And I think part of the answer has to do with the fact that Latin America, because of the size of our forests, keeping them in place is our single largest contribution to mitigating climate change. But obviously, the fact that we keep them up, represents an obstacle to a lot of economic and political interests, and therefore, this is why many of the people who take care of these forests have been targeted by all sorts of actors, whether it be state actors, non-state illegal actors, corporate actors. And the situation of what is happening is truly, truly dramatic. Just to show you very quickly a couple of, you can see the map, how they're spread out all over different Latin America. The colors that you see on the map represent the different sorts of attacks: physical attacks, murders, threats, legal harassment, forced disappearance, forced displacement. And you can see it spans the whole region. It's obviously much worse in some countries like Brazil, like Honduras, Mexico, Colombia. But you start to see it in all sorts of countries, even Costa Rica and Uruguay, who have, a much better security situations than the rest of the region. And just to show you a small, this graphic at the top shows how widespread these attacks are against members of ethnic minorities, who account, by our count, for at least 49% of the global attacks that we managed to track. We're obviously, probably under reporting. This is the information that we have, but you can see that we found attacks perpetrated against 160 different ethnic groups, which shows you not only that some of the most vulnerable groups are being targeted, but also the fact that it's these ethnic communities who are at the forefront of conservation, who are being facing the worst of these risks. We have tracked the different types of violence that I showed you, but now over the past 2 years, we're starting to see that even new patterns of violence are emerging, or at least something that we had not observed in the environmental field. We're starting to see, like, for example, this is a case that colleagues from Contracorriente, a very, very, very bold and courageous independent media outlet in Honduras, tracked down. Some of the environmental leaders of Guapinol, which is a very, very emblematic case, in Honduras and linked to Berta Cáceres, who was murdered, environmental and indigenous leader Berta Cáceres. And we started to see that the moment that there was these disinformation campaigns targeting many of these leaders, and they coincided right at the moment in which they were being, for example, criminalized. And what this investigation found was that this was, in effect, this was not a spontaneous campaign to basically tarnish their reputation, accusing them of having committed crimes, of having been involved in violence against civilians. And what we found was that basically this was an inauthentic and coordinated campaign to try to tarnish their reputation. And very soon after these campaigns were unleashed, there were physical attacks against them. And what this team of reporters found was that basically they were trying to, as a way of minimizing the visibility of the attacks against these leaders, they were trying to tarnish their reputation. So I think these are the kinds of issues that we should be aware of, and that we should probably that warrant collaborative efforts of investigation going forward. But what we're seeing, and I was discussing this with several colleagues before the webinar, is some of these attacks that we've observed against environmental leaders are also starting to be seen with environmental journalists, which is the subject matter that gathers us today. And the case of Dom Phillips, who was murdered in mid-2022 in the western Brazilian Amazon near the border with Peru, is emblematic. Barbara mentioned it. And I wanted to show you at least 3 other patterns of attacks against environmental leaders that we have been observing in Latin America. I think one thing that we've started to see is an appearance or an increase of physical harassment against environmental journalists, both from non-state and state actors. This is an example of what happened to a cross-border collaborative investigation team that launched the project Amazon Underworld a couple of months ago. What they did was basically map and show the different illegal economies in the Amazon basin, and also what interests, political, economic, lay behind them. And while they were traveling through a river, the Purue River, in the northwestern Brazilian Amazon, very near the Colombian border, this happened to them. They were stopped by a team of military police from Japurá, which is the municipality in the area, and their cameras and their equipment were confiscated. These guys were brandishing guns. They were clearly intimidating the journalists. This happened in February this year. They decided to not publish the information up until August, when the project was already launched. What was interesting about this case was that they immediately set out their security protocol, and which included placing calls for people in Bogota and Sao Paulo and Manaus, several people who were aware of this was a cross-border team, and they set in motion several of the steps that they had agreed upon beforehand, in case something happened. They were calling the embassies, they were calling the different federal authorities in Brazil, both police, military, Ministry of Justice. And in the end, actually, it was very intriguing. The explanation is not entirely clear, but 3 hours after they were, all their camera equipment was confiscated, and especially their camera cards had been deleted, these guys came up the river again and returned part of the equipment back to the journalists. Obviously, the camera cards had already been erased, and there was no way of recovering part of the information. But it showed that the security protocol was effective in protecting them, at least until they got out of the area. They immediately stopped reporting and left. What was behind all of this was probably the fact that they managed to prove it with one of the stories that was published as part of the investigation, that several of these police units are involved in protecting these illegal rackets of gold dredging, and also profiting from them. And this is what probably explains, this collusion of actors is what probably explains this episode. But this shows you that they are being also targeted, and subject to physical harassment. We're also seeing state-led legal harassment against journalists. This is Carolina Amaya, of courageous environmental journalist from El Salvador, who leads a small media outlet called Mala Hierba, specialized in environmental reporting in Central America. And something very, very odd happened to her. And this was ironically also in February this year. On the 28th of February, her father was detained, and he was detained on some of these strange charges that were invented by the current government of El Salvador, including illegal association and illegally blocking public roads, which are two crimes usually associated to gangs. This has to do with the fact that El Salvador was also criminalizing what the government shows as portraying gangs positively. In this case, Carolina had just 2 hours before her father's arrest, she had announced the publication of a story, and right at the same time the story was published, which is the one you see next door, he was arrested. She hasn't even been able to speak to him since. And there are, the facts are not very clear, but there are a lot of signs that have led her and others to think that her father's arrest is probably related to her journalistic work. And Carolina has, I think, is connected to a form of journalist that is very rare in Latin America, which is environmental journalists, having to do with illegal land use changes. And everything points out to the fact that it's related to her work, which is obviously very concerning. They have also received physical and online harassment. Basically people placed with signs saying they're pro gangs at the doors of their offices, and they have recently been hacked. And some of the audios that they had been recording of interviews and working with have been, they were tried to be erased online. So that was also very important. And finally, there's an increase in cases of legal harassment against journalists covering environmental issues. We have seen it twice over the past 4 times actually, over the past 2 years in 2 different issues. One is the carbon offset markets, irregularities there, and also irregularities in mining projects. We are seeing an increase of companies try to, slap suits have not been filed, but there is clearly the environment and the atmosphere leading up to it, harassing journalists to believe that they're going to be, that they're going to receive a lawsuit against them for their work, trying to portray them and present them as guilty of anything that happens, both economic and reputation-wise, to these companies on account of stories that have been, investigated thoroughly, fact-checked, legally assessed. Perhaps one of the most incredible cases of this that I've seen this year is this story from Brazil, which basically unveiled the ties that a Belgian tycoon had to a major gold refinery in the Brazilian Amazon. He threatened to sue everyone involved in this investigation for over $5 million. Obviously, the journalists, replied to his letter explaining why they would not take down the articles, which was, his demand. And ironically, exactly 1 month later, the U.S. Treasury placed sanctions on some of his family members. So which shows you probably what was at stake there. And to finalize there, I would say that there's at least 3 things that are interesting from these cases, and that I think could be added to maybe Barbara's list of good practices to minimize these risks. I think in the case of these physical harassments that are from the Amazon Underworld project, I think the importance of security protocols has to be very clear to all of us as journalists. The fact that we have them, that we use them, can actually minimize the harm that we may risk. That case showed that as it was immediately applied, and very, very quickly it showed its results. Obviously, it couldn't return the deleted material, but it got them home safely. In the second case of Carolina's case of this harassment, well, obviously we don't know what's happening to her father. There's a lot of uncertainty there. But one thing they've been doing is being very careful in keeping the records of all of these online harassments. This is information that may be used by specialized organizations like the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto that investigates, the use of spyware against journalists, or Access Now that specializes in, problems of hacking in tech. Keep a record of all of that. And in the case of legal harassment, I think I can't advise journalists enough tackling these sensitive subjects about the importance of getting legal assessment before they publish. It's probably could be costly, but a lot of us have found very good pro bono lawyers that do this for a living as well. And the fact that you have legal reviews and legal assessments is going to protect you much more than if you don't have them before publishing a very sensitive investigation. So I think I would leave it at that, and I think these are some of the things we're all observing right now.
Andrés, thank you very much indeed. I mean, I think that actually was really comprehensive and very practical and very useful. I think your advice and regarding the questions of security protocols, the need for monitoring is absolutely essential and useful. But you've also highlighted that the real sort of problem of the abuse of power in corporate and political centers of power, and how journalists need to work hard, not just to protect themselves, but also to protect their sources of information. And I think that that is really sort of essential. Look, thank you very much indeed for that. And I'm sure there will be questions arising from that. I wonder now if we can switch continents and move to Africa. I want to bring in Ruth Maclean and Caleb Kabanda. They work together on a really critical and vital story about the defense of peatlands in Central Africa, as important and another important part of the world where the protection of the environment and keeping the carbon in the ground is an absolutely vital part of dealing with the process of climate change and so on. And they won the Fetisov Journalism Award this year. Ruth is the bureau chief of the New York Times in West Africa. And Caleb is a man who seems to me to be an absolute sort of what I would regard as a sort of gold star representatives of all of those who people in journalism rely upon when they're going and traveling into areas to try and do difficult stories. Someone who understands the ground, works there as a journalist, has worked as a fixer, a translator, and so on. And I think his role is so extremely important, particularly because he works and comes from the area and knows the community so well. So Caleb is he's a freelance journalist, but he's so much else as well. So look, Ruth, Caleb, maybe Ruth, you can start, and then we'll talk to you, Caleb, afterwards about how did you approach this story, and what were the challenges you faced?
Thank you so much, Aidan, for those words. And yes, hi, Caleb. It's so lovely to see your face. Caleb and I have worked together for many years. And, the connection is not always that good in Congo. So I don't always get to see his face. It's so nice. And just to echo what you said, Aidan, really, this story and so many of the stories that I've worked on in Congo would have been completely impossible without Caleb. So we were very much partners in this, us both, and then the wonderful photographer Nana Heitman, who also was key to bringing this story to life. So the story that we worked on was about the peatlands in the Congo Basin. And I was actually just looking back through some of my emails when I started kind of opening this conversation with some of my editors and talking about wanting to cover it. And it's interesting to look back and remember that I really had no idea what I was going to find, what we were going to find when we showed up in the city of Mbandaka in Congo, and then traveled from there, on roads into the forest and on boats down tributaries of the River Congo to other villages alongside these peatlands. I mean, I knew that these peatlands had been recently, in quotes, discovered, but didn't really know all that much about how that had been received on the ground. And the discovery of things like peatlands or all sorts of things in Africa is kind of a trope, really, because who is discovering them? Well, it's often outsiders, and the people living there, of course, knew that they were there all along. And such was the case with these peatlands. Of course, there were people who'd lived in the area for thousands of years who knew very well what peatlands were, who even, had a word for them, Ntoku, in the case of one of the communities we interviewed, and who used them. They found that they were a very good source of things that they used in their daily lives, whether for building materials or for cooking, or for all sorts of things. So, in a way, scientists had discovered them, and we turned up and discovered them for ourselves, but we were guided there by communities that we met there. So, the two particular communities that we ended up focusing on, we had no idea even existed before we arrived in the area. So when I was proposing this idea to my editors, it was much more through the lens of there is this huge network of peatlands in the Congo, which is extremely important to the world's environment. And beyond that, really, it was sort of, let's go and look and see what the impact of them has been on communities in the area. Yeah, I think it was extremely interesting to get there and spend a few weeks looking into it and getting to know the communities. I would say, having covered Africa for quite a few years, almost a decade, it is a very undercovered continent, and Congo in particular. It's a difficult country to get to from the outside. It's a difficult country to get permission to cover. It's a difficult country to move around. Just to give you an example, Mbandaka, the city that we were based in while we were doing a lot of this reporting, there's only one weekly flight, or at least at the time, there was only one weekly flight out to the capital, Kinshasa. So you really had to get on that. And you had to kind of, decide in advance when you were going to travel. And this kind of reporting and these kinds of logistics are really expensive. So I think that is a huge barrier to covering some of these kinds of stories, because media budgets have been shrinking, obviously, for years. And, you really need a committed news organization to spend the kind of money that it takes to get to a remote place like Mbandaka, like Penzele and Lokolama, the two villages we mainly worked in, and then to keep you there long enough to really learn something interesting. And I think my attitude towards to doing any story is usually to try to look at the people involved. That, I think, helps bring to life all sorts of stories, and in particular environmental stories. I think rather than just looking at environmental resources, looking at the people who live around them, the people who use them, the people who protect them, is really key. And to get to know the communities that we wrote about took time. It took many days of sitting around in villages, having hours and hours of conversations, following up, going to the peatlands, going back to the peatlands. Everything took a lot of time. And so, we were really lucky that the New York Times decided to invest in this project. We were working with a section of the New York Times called Headway, which its mission is to explore the world's challenges through the lens of progress. And they were a really great editing and support team to have. We were also lucky to get there at to get to the area that we were focusing on at a really good time. You know, we showed up just when things were coming to a head between two villages who lived adjacent to a big peatland and who both considered it theirs. So we were able to witness in real time how these issues play out. And in this case, how a piece of land, which is sort of like a swamp, turns out to be, in some sense, incredibly valuable to the world. But it's not exactly clear why it's so valuable and what should happen as a result. And we were able to witness these two communities trying to sort of come to terms with that and figure that out in real time. So we were lucky with our timing, but I would say, you know, I think that often when you get to a place and you spend enough time and you really try to understand people and stories, you can often get lucky if you
Right.
if you have the time to invest. I mean, I think you know, it was such a great experience, and I would say that getting this award really is a great thing, because I think it helps editors see that it's worth investing in this kind of journalism, and I think that the world needs a lot more of it. Obviously, you know, the Congo Basin is an incredible resource for the world, and needs to be protected and needs to be covered by the media. So I think the more coverage there can be, the better, and the more the world recognizes that stories in Africa are really important to cover and sends resources in that direction, the better. But anyway, I think I've for too long, and I should hand over to the wonderful Caleb, who really enabled this reporting and just sat with me for hours talking to this villager and that, arranged all the logistics, ensured that we had drinking water and didn't go hungry ever, that everything went smoothly and safely, and you know, most of all, I think helped us sensitively negotiate working in these communities without upsetting the balance and the relations
Sure.
between them. So over to you, maybe, Caleb.
I'm so glad to attend to this webinar, and I'm so happy to see your face, Ruth. It has been too long. So thank you so much. Thank you so much. In fact, if I can have to talk a little bit about my background and experience. I've worked several times with a lot of reporters from different international media agencies and foundations. I worked as a fixer, as translator, security advisor, film producer, camera operator for some of them. So I've worked with many, with the New York Times, Washington Post, Associated Press, BBC, NBC, Al Jazeera, ZDF, STV, CNN, National Geographic, and many others. I've worked also with different independent filmmakers, such as Melanie, Paul Friedman, and I've also worked with some celebrities and organizations, even foundations, like Ben Affleck, Ross Camp, General Romeo Dallaire, the Noble Women's Initiative, the Howard Buffett Foundation, the International Women's Media Foundation, and many, many, many NGOs. So I started working as a fixer and translator since 1996, and I've worked across all the 26 provinces of the DRC many times with different journalists reporting on many stories. And I've also traveled to the United States of America for work, to work on transcripts on the films that I contributed just to, I helped the filmmakers to do, such as the film Mercy Congo, Conflict-Free Minerals, Until There Is Peace. So that's what I can say about my background and experience. So with regards to our award-winning story, titled "God Do Protectors of the Congo's Peatlands Get in Return," bureaucracies, political obstacles, and how we gain confidence and trust from local community. So when Ruth Maclean contacted me and told me that she wanted to do the story, she told me that she wants mainly to focus on a human story side. She told me that she wants to spend much time with local communities who are around the Congo's peatlands. She wanted to see how they live with peatlands. What do they do with peatlands, and what do people know about the peatlands, and also what the peatlands mean to them and to the whole community, and more. So I felt very excited because I found the story very interesting, especially because she was the first international reporter who came to visit the peatlands and wanted to spend much time with a local community living around the peatlands. Yet it was tough to get permission to go to the peatlands areas. It required expensive logistics, like she said, but also much bureaucracies and political obstacles, because some government officials, military officials, local loggers, and international logging companies are involved in the illegal exploitation of timbers in the Congo basins. So there is it's hard, very hard to access to the peatlands by roads, because the peatlands are located in very remote areas, in the very deep jungle of the Congo basins forest, where there is no cell phone receptions, no access to the internet. The only way to communicate with the outside is by using sat phones. So when you are in Kinshasa, the capital city of the DRC, before you travel, you need to get the paperwork, the media accreditation to enable you work as a journalist in the Congo. And it's very expensive. There is much bureaucracy, and even if you have it, you still need to have stamps from the security services, such as the ANR, which stands like the Congolese FBI, and it's too much demanding, and it takes really time, and it's really boring. Like Ruth said, to travel from Kinshasa to get to Mbandaka, which is like the capital city of the region where peatlands are located, there is a single flight per day. There is a single flight per week where you have to travel. There are many people who want to travel to get to those places, and it's really tough. And when you are in Mbandaka, you reach to Mbandaka, it's not yet. You still need to do more bureaucracies to get stamps from the ANR, from the local governments, and you need to get the stamps from the Ministry of Environment, and then travel to the villages where the peatlands are located. And when you get there, you still need to do more bureaucracies by meeting the local chiefs.
Can I ask you, because all of that sounds absolutely a mountain to climb for any journalist coming from the outside. It would be impossible without someone like you on the spot, and to be able to navigate, negotiate, and find a way for that story to be told. So how do you think foreign correspondents, journalists from the outside, what advice do you give to them about how, when they're going into areas where there is this threat of bureaucracy, there are the problems, the logistics, how does one deal with that? They need someone like you, always.
Yes, for sure. In the DRC, it is quite impossible for foreign journalists to do reportings without experienced local fixers.
Exactly.
It's really impossible because it's, you know, a country which is like there is no rule of law. It's a country where there is much corruption. Government officials are involved in so many things, and for them, because they are involved in so many things, they think that when international reporters come to do stories, they will show the abuses that they commit. They will show illegal things that they commit. So my advice to avoid my advice to international reporters is to ask them to get all paperwork that are needed, the media accreditation, and the whole steps that are required to enable the journalists to be protected, and also the fixer or the local producer who is working with them to be also protected.
So that is so important. That is so critical. There are a number of points you highlighted there, which I think are so right. The question of investing in the local people on the spot. I mean, I think, for example, it must be really important to try to strengthen local journalism in the DRC, to try to sort of assist local journalists in what they're trying to do in order to be able to tell their stories. But also this question of making sure that all journalists are aware of the potential threats to the sources that they're using in order to get information. Because very often what can happen is someone can come in from the outside, they can pick up a story, they can leave, they can publish that story, but the people who are their sources remain on the spot and potentially remain vulnerable to whatever backlash may come from information that is revealed that is potentially damaging to centers of power. So I mean, I think that sort of whole question of preparation before you go, relying on people on the spot, and something that we in the international community need to think about more is how do we encourage more investment in local journalism in areas like the Congo, where this sort of story needs to be told more and more. So that is an issue. Look, thank you both very much indeed. There's no question at all that the point that Barbara made about more resources being made available to tell this story is very clear. This story would not have been told without the New York Times and without the money behind the New York Times. So this question of public interest journalism and how it can tell this vital story for humanity is actually a challenge to all of us, and one that we actually have to deal with that. Thank you very much indeed, both of you, for that. I wonder if I can move on quickly now to Karla. Our final speaker takes us back to Latin America. Karla, you know, what is there to be said? There's so much to be said about you, Karla. So trying to boil it down to a sort of a small amount is very difficult. Award-winning Brazilian journalist, works for Mongabay, a fellow of the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, Rainforest Investigations Network. Also, recently elected a board member of the Society of Environmental Journalists and appointed as the Society's Vice President and Chair of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion. I mean, there's no more to be said. Karla, nice to have you with us. Please, over to you.
No, thank you so much. I'm also honored to be here, to be with great panelists, and I think that the subjects we're talking about, they really overlap and complement each other. And yeah, congratulations to you all for the great work. And well, I'll be talking about today about a specific story that was published a week ago about the threats to environmental defenders. We talked here about the threats for journalists, and the environmental defenders are also constant under threat. And complement what Aidan said, it's really important for us who usually go to the ground and come back to our homes to be aware of not putting our sources at risk. Of course, that it's been a challenge, and several times in the stories that I did, that, you know, the person was like exposing wrongdoing and illegal activities there. It would be really good to name that person. But then I remember that doing several interviews with anthropologists, NGOs, people usually say that naming them, you are protecting them, because, you know, you have this public awareness about who these people are and the threats they're facing. And the story I'll be talking about talks about a very sad story, because that's a source that I interviewed 4 years ago for a documentary film at the time for Thomson Reuters Foundation. I did a documentary film and a story about the Guardians of the Forest, who are a group of Guajajara Indigenous from the Brazilian Amazon. And what they do, they go to the front line to defend their land. Their land is officially demarcated since 1990. They should be fully protected, as, you know, according to the Brazilian law. But what happens is these forests are huge, there's no real enforcement on the ground. And the only way they found to protect themselves was to go to the front line and fight for their land. And then at the time we published the story, and it's 9 months after I did the interview, Paulo Paulino Guajajara was murdered in an ambush, allegedly by loggers. And this story speaks also a lot about what happened to Don and Bruno, because at the time that I published this story, I knew Don Phillips. I live in Rio. Don Phillips lived there for a while. I met him with a group of international correspondents there. And Don was one of the very first journalists to write a story about the Guardians back in 2015. So I remember him praising the film and that. And Bruno Pereira worked at FUNAI at the time, and I interviewed him already. So like, the documentary film was released in May 2019. Paulo Paulino Guajajara was murdered in November 2019. Before that, I always wanted to be back, because at the time I couldn't cover all the wrongdoings. And one thing that is really important to trace the supply chains to expose the wrongdoing and what's behind it. I couldn't go there before, and after, especially after the murders of Don and Bruno, I felt that mission to be back and claim for justice. And of course, environmental journalism is expensive, but beyond, of course, not all outlets have reliable funding like the New York Times and other outlets. But the good news is that we have very independent initiatives supporting investigative journalism, like the Pulitzer Center, where I'm a fellow. Andrés Bermúdez is also a fellow. Beyond the fellowships, they have rolling grants on rolling basis. So I really encourage everyone interested in doing environmental investigative journalism to look for these sources. I'm happy to share the links afterwards so we can put it as well. And then I finally managed to come back to the Araribóia territory in Amazon in August this year. And when I was there, beyond the big investigation that I'm doing, really into supply chains, illegal timber is the main thing there. And I found out other wrongdoing that being on the ground is really important to know what's happening indeed. But I felt really this urgency to release a first story to help claim for justice. not only for Paulo Guajajara, but for all environmental defenders, environmental journalists trying to protect our biomes, because there is a lot of impunity. In Brazil, for example, as Andrés showed, is one of the countries where environmental defenders face the highest number of murders and threats. But on the other hand, nobody has been charged. In the case of indigenous environmental defenders, nobody has ever gone to jail because of that. And Paulo Guajajara's case will be a landmark as the first case to go to a federal jury in Brazil. And what that means, because usually homicides go to the state courts. They are treated like an individual issue. But this case, prosecutors made the case that his murder was an aggression against the entire community, because he was there in the role of an forest protector. And his death had all this effect on the community. So I came back there. I interviewed his father, and I interviewed Laércio Guajajara, who is also a forest guardian who survived the ambush. They were one of the most toughest interviews I've done in my career, because they'll be really dealing with a sensitive topic and coming back to details of things. But then I'm happy that I'm there. I was there to talk to them and help to make justice. So I'd like to share with you the video. It's a 10-minute video that we released last Monday.
Esse daqui é o mutaco que o madeireiro fez aí. Enquanto tem uns que estão rachando estaco aí, o outro tá vigiando aqui. Com arma de fogo, ele fica ali em cima, assim, ó. Já sentadinho ali em cima, assim, já esperando. Quem para o guardião passar aqui já atirar. Já aconteceu tiros já, assim, com a...
Paulo Paulino Guajajara was murdered in an ambush, allegedly by loggers, a few months after we filmed this interview in 2019.
Lá no povoado lá tem caralho lá branco que tá jurando de me matar. E agora mesmo não tá nem com um mês que ele andou atrás de mim para matar eu, por causa que eu defendo a floresta.
E ele é madeireiro?
Mas ele é pago por madeireiro, igualmente eu falei ali. Madeireiro, ele é pistoleiro pago por madeireiro. Nós se sentimos muito sozinhos, assim, sem ajuda. Nós estamos precisando de ajuda, muito apoio aqui nessa terra aqui para nós.
Paulo was a target given his work as a guardian of the forest, a member of a group of indigenous Guajajara in Araribóia who oversee external threats in their territory to protect their community, and also the uncontacted Awa, considered the most threatened indigenous group on the planet. Although the entrance of outsiders is prohibited under Brazilian law, crimes like illegal logging and illegal hunting regularly occur in Araribóia. That's why the Guardians Group was born a decade ago. In the past 20 years, more than 50 Guajajara individuals have been killed in Maranhão, with none of the perpetrators ever being tried. Paulo's case is expected to be a landmark as the first indigenous murder case to go to a federal jury. In August 2023, I got back to Araribóia to talk with Paulo's family and the other guardian who survived the ambush, Laércio Guajajara, to bring the case into the spotlight again because the crime hasn't been tried after 4 years.
Trago muita lembrança ainda, todo dia, né? Nunca esqueci o que aconteceu lá. Nós já tínhamos combinado, rapaz, guerreiro, bora dar uma caçada lá na região com os Auatão, bora. Tragédia que nós não esperávamos, a gente, né, se deparou lá no local, né, onde os invasores tinham deixado os transportes deles. Nós avaliamos lá, né, eram madeireiros, né, caçando madeira, identificando os locais. De repente, os caçadores chegaram. Pouca conversa, poucas palavras. Quando eu saí aqui, né, passei na frente do Paulo aqui. Quando eu fui olhar por detrás da árvore, o caçador já vinha com a espingarda, né? E atirou, né? Quando eu olhei para o lado, né, eu nunca esqueço, meu companheiro já estava no chão. Acho que não deu tempo ele dar nem um tiro. Por isso que a gente considera como emboscada mesmo. Aí no momento lá, né, eu percebi que o companheiro já estava morto. Eu olhei no olho dele, né, tava assim diferente, bem mesmo amarelinho, né, dentro. Quando eu ia aqui estava aberto, né, aqui um buraco aqui, né, passei a mão nas costas, eu senti assim uns caroços, que eram as balas, que quase sai aqui, né. Uma varou, saiu, né, conseguiu, que passou aqui dentro de mim aqui, né, aqui, entrou aqui, passou aqui por dentro e saiu no meio das costas aqui, 4 balotes. Né, tupando mesmo que me salvou, que eu não sei nem como foi isso, né. Eu tive que correr, né? Porque eu pensava assim, se esses invasores tivessem conseguido matar nós dois, eu e o Paulo, eles iam esconder nós dentro da floresta. Quem era que ia achar? Ninguém ia achar eu morro Paulo nunca mais na vida. Uma floresta desse tamanho aí.
O Laércio deu um depoimento muito rico, muito emocionante, no sentido de que nem ele mesmo sabe como sobreviveu àquela emboscada, né? É simbólico e diz muito que o assassinato tenha ocorrido quando os índios verificaram que havia invasores, pessoas não autorizadas dentro da terra. Então, assim, era um local propriamente que só quem conhecia aquela área chegaria até ali. Isso torna muito claro e isso ajudou a que a investigação fosse concluída no sentido de que aquele assassinato não era só uma briga entre particulares, mas entre a comunidade indígena e pessoas que usavam da terra sem autorização.
Paulo's murder became a symbol of the Guardians' fight to protect the Araribóia territory. Prosecutors considered his death as an aggression against the entire Guajajara community and indigenous culture.
O pessoal sabe quem matou meu filho. Eles não prendem porque eles não querem, eu não sei se eles têm dinheiro, não é como... Nós estamos morrendo, não tem a justiça. Eu nunca vi um branco que matou índio presa, nunca. Porque minha mãe foi morta de madeireira e meu cunhado foi matado de madeireira, que é o Santino. E agora foi meu filho.
O Laércio me enviou uma mensagem no caminho para cá e eu falei, estou indo conversar com o procurador, você quer mandar algum recado? E ele falou, eu queria que perguntasse para ele quando vai ser o julgamento.
Então, assim, eu quero dar essa resposta para ele da data do júri, que ela vai ocorrer o mais breve possível. E que, assim, a justiça conta com ele, conta com o depoimento dele, porque, afinal de contas, ele é a testemunha, que a gente diz, né, ocular daquele momento. E, ao mesmo tempo, é fundamental o depoimento dele para que, para frente, né, a esperança da comunidade não se perca. Ela confie que o Estado brasileiro pode, sim, efetivamente dar uma resposta. A vida é o bem mais precioso que tem e o tribunal não pode devolver a vida. Mas ele pode, sim, privar de liberdade aqueles que destruíram a vida. E pode, em outras searas, reafirmar essa cultura tão bonita que é a cultura indígena e que é a representatividade de todo o trabalho dos guardiões da floresta, onde estavam Paulo e o Laércio. E é isso que a gente espera alcançar, quem sabe realizar agora no primeiro semestre de 2024, o julgamento. E já sair de lá com os réus presos. Então é isso que eu tenho para falar para a família do Paulo Guajajara. O sonho vale a pena e tem de continuar.
Nós não podemos acabar nossa mata, porque se acabar, aí acaba a nossa cultura também. E por isso nós não deixamos de lutar na mata. Como meu filho também não é o Paulo, a mãe dele sei que a mãe dele falava para ele largar desse negócio de lutar, né, por aí, né, com esses invasão. Aí ele diz, não mãe, porque eu não estou roubando, eu não estou mexendo nada que a lei. Apenas que eu estou protegendo a mata nossa aqui, porque nós temos que reservar essa mata para o nosso filho, para o nosso neto, para o bisneto. Então eu não deixo de lutar. O
sonho é o nosso, né? O sonho nosso do Lobo é ver esse território realmente protegido. Né? No dia que não tiver mais nenhum tipo de invasão aqui, né? Nenhum tipo de ilícito, nosso sonho está realizado. Né? Quando não tiver mais direito, não tiver mais caçador. Quando tiver um guerreiro, né, que está com o sonho dos outros que foram, né, ficado para trás, enquanto nós tiver com o sonho deles também na cabeça, nós vamos lutar para chegar lá. Né? Tem muito guerreiro sonhando isso que o Lobo sonhou, né, que eu sonho hoje ainda. Por isso, até hoje eu estou aqui, né? E enquanto Deus não me tirar também, né?
Thank you very much indeed, Karla. That was a very moving story, and it really encapsulates the struggle, the emotional toll, and the commitment of people in the region. And it shows the value of telling stories that are human focused. That when we look at the environment, so much of the environment and the issues related to climate are the subject of technical debate, in which there's a lot of discussion about the theories and the consequences and the long-term perspectives. But the reality of this is a story for today. There are real people really suffering whose story needs to be told. And I think that that's a tremendous piece of film, and I think it really illustrates how important it is. And it also sort of highlights, I think, the issues that Barbara, unfortunately, who's had to leave us, also raised. Some of the questions that she posed was, why is it that the environmental story has to be depressing? What else can we say about it? And I think that film, in a way, shows that the environmental story can be uplifting. It can actually be a way of telling a story which focuses on the dramatic commitment and achievement, and also the value of the human spirit in being able to confront real power and being able to achieve something, to get the authorities to recognize that this is something that has to be dealt with, shows that there is real impact that can be achieved. And so I think that it's tremendous also from that point of view. I mean, I wonder if we can if we can ask all of you now who might be able to help deal with some of the other points that Barbara made in her introduction about that question about, are we journalists or are we activists? Karla, I felt that very much you produced a piece of journalism which what I would call solutions-based journalism. You were pointing to ways in which problems can be solved. Did you feel it was activist journalism? Do you feel sometimes that there is a collision between your desire for progress, social progress, and change, and the need for a journalist to have distance? And can a journalist, or should a journalist ever have distance from this sort of story? What do you think?
Oh, thank you so much for the question, for the opportunity to show this piece. Before answering, I just would like to give you a little bit of background, because the interview that you saw from Paulo, that was a death foretold, he told me, wasn't part of the main documentary in 2019. And it was hammering in my head since then that I really needed to do, especially because this film won 4 international awards, like this is the most awarded project of my career. So I felt this mission of give it back somehow to the community, helping to fight for justice. And I know that environmental journalists, some people, for a long time, environmental and climate coverage were treated like as a leftist subject by most of media, and only in recent years, where the climate crisis emerging, that, you know, basically everyone is covering it now. And I think that we focus on do unbiased journalism and really hear everyone, rely on the facts. But I think that the journalist has a side of justice. We have to fight for that. Yeah, and there was a big discussion in an event I was in Brazil recently, and I found it really interesting because they rose this perspective of journalism of cause. So it's for the environmental cause. We are a position that we're fighting for the environment and fighting for justice. I don't think there is any problem on saying that, but we are relying on facts. We're hearing everyone, and to bring this case, if there were injustice, we all were fighting to get a better world and to have justice made for everyone that's been, harassed.
I think that's so true. There's another element to this which we've got a question from Raluca about, which is, and also this is a question for all of you, but particularly you, Karla, and Caleb, I think is the question about how do you explore the tensions that there are between visibility and identity protection for your sources, bearing in mind that when they talk to you, they could potentially put themselves at risk. How do you protect them from not suffering bad consequences as a result of talking to you as a journalist? What steps do you take to ensure that their protection is also a priority as well as getting the story?
Yeah, it's a tension sometimes, and I confess that after Paulo was murdered, it came to my mind that if he was exposed somehow in the film or that, but the guardians, because they call themselves guardians of the forest, they said no, and we see that their fight continues. So like Paulo was murdered, other were murdered, and they keep fighting. So like they don't want to die, of course, but like what they make clear is that their fight to protect their land is above their lives. And so they really want to show to the world all the work they're doing. Of course, there was in some circumstances in other stories where the source told me, the information on the record, and I took a step back. I thought it may be complicated as a consequence to the source, and then so I double checked and then changed it sometimes.
Caleb, how did you see that dealing with the community that you were dealing with in DRC?
Yeah, the communities we met for our story, they were convinced, and they were looking forward to letting the story get known. So we knew the challenges and all the problems that are around, but we managed to do our best to not put them into danger, because we knew the problems that are happening on the ground. Like Ruth explained, the two communities, the Pensele community and the Lokolama community, there were tensions which were there, and we arrived at the real time when the tensions were rising up, and there were also the government officials and some NGOs which weren't able to handle the problems of who owned the peatlands according to the traditions and also according to the origins. So Ruth was very sensitive, and she did not want really that we create problems, or after our departure,
sure,
the communities to have problems. So we managed just to listen all the communities to. We were very friendly to them, so we spent much time to them. They were very open to us, and we got time to meet other actors involved, the NGOs involved, government officials involved. And the way Ruth wrote the story, it was very, very professional, to the point that even if you read a story, the local communities, all the people who we interviewed, couldn't get into danger. So she tried really to tell the story in a way to satisfy even the people we interviewed, the actors, so that the problem can be addressed, the stories can be told, but to avoid that, after our departure, no one gets problem, but the story is told.
That's such an important lesson, that there is a way of good journalism telling the story without isolating and potentially targeting the source of information who is still on the spot. And I think that is, I mean, that's really important. Andrés, do you have anything to add to that?
I agree fully with what Karla and Caleb were saying. I think that there's clearly a justice and an accountability gap where it comes to violence against environmental defenders. And we, of course, have to be, be fair, but also I think it's correctly placed when we are morally outraged when it's due. And I think these are the kind of issues that demand our moral outrage, and we simply have to go on reporting about them with all fairness and with all the journalistic process. But that doesn't mean necessarily, that doesn't mean not shining a light on these justice gaps.
Okay, I mean, I think that's a really important point you make about the question of sort of moral outrage and so on. But it isn't very often the best way to express moral outrage is through the lives of others, by actually relying on the facts and the information that you get from the ground. Through the facts that you reveal as a journalist itself is self-revelation of injustice and something that is morally unacceptable and so on. So that's the skill of the journalism, and I think that you've highlighted that very well. The last question that came up, and before we move towards sort of winding it up, and I see if there's any more questions, is this question of mainstreaming environmentalism. How do we take the environmental story and make it a part of, well, almost every other branch of journalism? Certainly financial journalism, certainly social affairs, maybe even areas, local authorities dealing with sport, for example, the other aspects of journalism and areas of journalism. Is there scope for mainstreaming? How do we do it inside journalism itself? How do we get other journalists to take seriously the environmental story? Anyone wish to try to deal with that question? I mean, I would help, because I would take the view that this is a challenge for editors. It's a challenge for people who run news outlets. that if they want to build credibility for their journalism, if they want to build public trust in the stories they tell, they should make sure that the stories they tell fully reflect the impact of climate change and environmental issues on all aspects of people's lives. And I think that question is a really important one for at a time when journalism is under pressure, when public trust in journalism is weakening, and largely because of the deteriorating nature of the information environment generally, that journalism needs to become even more trustworthy. It needs actually to win back people's confidence. And I think sort of bringing into the mainstream of journalism these sorts of stories, so that we recognize there is a need for our different beats, but at the same time, there are some overriding issues that we need to be aware of at the same time. That's certainly true when we talk about politics, and it's certainly true when we talk about human rights. It's also an issue that we may look at in terms of the issues related to the environment. So, I mean, we've got a comment, which I think is an important one, that someone is saying that we need activism is needed for solutions. It comes from Gabriel Baglo in Africa, who's saying that that there are so many challenges facing journalism. The problem of impunity, safety, the impact of the climate crisis, poverty. So it's impossible in many ways for journalists not to be engaged in the issues that are affecting the communities that they serve. And the challenge for them is to be professional in the way that they do it. And I think the stories we've heard from here are inspiring examples of actually how that can be done. So I think that's tremendous. Look, thank you very much indeed. I have to say, this has been just such a tremendous session in which we've heard such great stories and experiences, which I think anyone listening will sort of really learn a lot from. But we haven't finished yet, because I want to now sort of bring in Nadezda Azhgikhina, who is a member of the steering committee of the Fetisov Journalism Awards, my good friend, and also someone who is touched very much by the issues that we're dealing with. Nadia, what do you think we have learned for the FJA, and what are the prospects for the coming period in this area?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I should tell that I'm deeply impressed with our conversation. I think it's more than success. It's like a new perspective for all of us. It's what we really need. And what I think it would be fantastic if young journalists or journalism schools could use tape of this webinar for education, because it's fantastic master class about contemporary courage of journalism and personal involvement, and so many issues are raised and explained and presented. And finally, final court, Karla's short documentary, you know, it means that journalism matters, even today, even in this hostile environment. Of course, our profession is today, the whole profession is space of resistance to different challenges. And many important issues have been risen. And of course, mainstreaming of environmental journalism is probably one of the most important. And I would like to remind that the main mission of Fetisov Journalism Awards was to highlight responsible and honest journalism as a public good, and to support those journalists who produce this journalism and develop this journalism. And we have fantastic examples, and we will listen to real heroes of our profession, and we all are proud of them, and no doubts. It means that one of 4 nominations of the awards is really one of the most important. Of course, there is still some notion that environmental journalism is more scientific, or it's like a supplement to other issues like human rights, investigation of corruption, peace and war reporting, and so on. But now we see that it's not at all. It's in the heart of all contemporary investigations and fight for human rights and human destiny. And I think that award itself could contribute and does already into mainstreaming of journalism. I would like to share with you some figures I got from colleagues about, for example, number of applications in this nomination of environmental journalism. In 2022, we got publications from 40 countries. This year from 56. What is also important, and we will listen to this, that many works are being produced by teams, by a group of people, which included media professionals and experts and stringers and volunteers. And I think it could resolve the issue of a sort of conflict between journalism and activism. If in one team we have journalists and activists, it's very fruitful, and we see that results are fantastic. And without activists, without stringers are media professionals in many ways, but in some ways they are activists as well. So we could get very good results. So team work was increased like 20% during recent years among those who sent publications to the award. What was also important, that not only single articles, but serial of articles, serial of publications increased, and 40% of all articles are presented by serial of articles. And also use of multimedia, every fourth application includes visuals and other parts of media production. I think that today we had very important meeting, and definitely I think probably we should prepare some, not statement, but some summary of it and distribute it, and probably to publish it as a result of this very important professional discussion, which highlights new dimension of our profession today. And I am admiring all our participants, real heroes, Andrés, Ruth, Caleb, Karla. I think we should applaud. I think we should promote more our winners and our real heroes. Thank you very much.
Nadia, thank you very much indeed. And I think that your devotion, and with Eva, to the Fetisov Journalism Awards and the promotion of it, has been an inspiration in itself. I know that it has made a difference to the lives of many journalists who have been working in difficult areas, to be able to have some resources in order to follow up their stories. It's one good thing to do a winning story. It's another thing to follow it up, to find out what more needs to be done. So I mean, I have to say that it has, you're quite right, been a sort of tremendously inspiring discussion. And I'm very, very grateful, like you, Nadia, to Karla and to Caleb and Ruth and to Andrés, for your participation today. It has been really sort of tremendous. And I think you've made it clear why we need not just to sort of continue to seek out the best that environmental journalism can provide, but we need to encourage more environmental journalism. We need to make sure that this story is being spread, being disseminated, and being picked up and being used more by mainstream media. This is not a technical, theoretical question. This is a human question. It affects all of us. It affects humanity, and it is actually a story that needs to be told in order to defend the future of humanity. So thank you all very much indeed. We will make a report of this. We will circulate the video and the transcript of what we have been talking about this evening. It has been a tremendous privilege to listen to what you have had to say. So I want to thank you, and also to thank the FJA team for putting all of this together. Thank you all very much indeed. And let's all keep in touch. And I look forward very much to seeing you for the future. Thank you all, and good day. See you later. Bye-bye. Take care. Thank you all very much.